Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the nonprofit accounting podcast. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler, and with me, as always, is Mark Pallardy.
Hey, everyone.
Got a great episode this week. We have an article from Charity Navigator talking about giving during an economic downturn. What are some strategies your nonprofit can go into with a looming recession? Are we there? Are we not? We'll figure out in a few months. But looking at how that economic downturn affects your giving numbers, your donations, corporate and private, and maybe some strategies behind how you can stem that. And then we talk about branding, marketing, show your true self, why branding is essential to nonprofits. Talk about good branding strategies, how marketing strategies have changed over the last 30 years, and how to, engage or start thinking about how you want to rebrand or brand your nonprofit. And then we follow up from our last episode, part 2, on the 10 nonprofit funding models. We'll do the last 6. And this comes our way of the Stanford Social Innovation Review, one of our favorite publications here. And it's a really interesting dive into the different funding models, or thinking about how what funding model your nonprofit falls into, and they break it down into essentially 10 pieces. We'll talk in depth about the last 6 and kind of give our overview on funding sources overall from this article that is really interesting. The link is down in the subscription, but please take a look, because Mark and I really enjoyed this article. And then the last one is a question of our week. And actually, it was a discussion I had with a client on how to fire a non-profit employee gracefully. How do you go about letting somebody go? And what are the kind of the things to think about when doing that, and some strategies behind letting somebody go at a nonprofit? And we'll talk about all that and more this week. But Mark, you got our first article. Why don't you take it away? All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome back. Blah, 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 blah. Mark, you got our first article for us. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. This first article is called Giving During Economic Downturns. And this is from Charity Navigator. And it's basically looking at the state of the economy today and trying to anticipate what happens as we head into a period that definitely not yet called a recession, but definitely shows some signs of serious economic slowdown, and of course, inflation playing a factor in here as well. So Charity Navigator is asking, what do we do in those economic downturns? So there's kind of two sides to this coin, right? During an economic downturn, often charities are needed more, right? Because you have people who have food insecurity or other services that nonprofits provide. So the need for specific nonprofits goes up. And then, of course, on the other side, in an economic downturn, giving can go down because people don't have the extra disposable income that they might consider, going out towards a charitable organization. And when the market starts to turn and, there are sustained losses, people see that as, well, I better turtle up and hold some of my money close to the vest, because this is how my giving is calculated. So, the article first compares kind of with 2008, the last recession that we officially had in this country, and how charitable giving dropped 7% in 2008, followed by another 6.2% in 2009. And then when it finally started to rebound in 2010, there was just a 1.1% increase. So when it takes a dip, it doesn't come up as fast as the dip happens. In 2020, we had some record giving, and that was primarily because of the pandemic. So that's, we don't necessarily aren't looking for a black swan event where people come out of the woodwork to give because everybody's in such dire need. But when we're kind of in this place where the economic downturn is slow and progressive, how do we look at that as a nonprofit, and how do we sustain our way of living and way of producing and way of effectively giving back to the community with higher needs and lower revenue? So some action steps for donors is they give kind of a 3-prong approach. Calculate what your budget is. So depending on where you're at, see what is really reasonable for you to give. And if it's decreased among rising costs, but you can still be generous, or you can be generous with your time, but not necessarily your coin. That's also helpful. Assess your strategy. So kind of try to figure out where your giving is going to go and where it's needed the most, because just giving slipshod to anybody who asks you for something might not be the best strategy in a downturn. Try to figure out what critical services are and where you can help the most. And then commit to giving, right? So recurring gifts that maybe you won't notice, sustaining memberships to specific places, or just an automatic withdrawal of a certain number of funds that, if it's gone every month and you're not going to necessarily feel the pain of that because it's already been leaving your wallet. That's another strategy to kind of mentally prepare yourself. And then for the charities, on the charity side, they suggest to shift your message, right? Get really pointed and get clear as to why your needs might have changed, with the changing economics, and then inform your donors and let them know what's going on. Double down on your retention. Try to really get those people who have given in the past, explain to them how important it is, that they help sustain you during lean times. And then focus on high net worth donors. They probably still have a good deal of money to spend. And really, if you can cultivate and court them in such a way that they really can continue to give, that can help sustain you during lean times. So I thought it was an interesting article. I think we'll probably see more of this as a recession looms. I don't even want to, put the boogeyman out there, but we can definitely see the change in the economy. So, AJ, what are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, and I think the boogeyman's already out there, kind of. I think looming recession. I think all indicators so far kind of show that that's where we're headed. So I think wise advice from Charity Navigator, but I would also mention that I think when they make an article like this just talking about donations, I think it underpins one of our tenets that we've kind of trumpeted on this show is diversifying your revenue streams. And so if there's kind of an inverse correlation between like grant funding and donations, where a lot of government and state grants, there's more money in that during an economic downturn as they're trying to stem the tides and kind of provide the private nonprofit sector with more money to be able to serve their needs. And that's when like personal or even corporate donations slow down. Individual giving and corporate giving kind of slow down during those economic downturns. So I think having like a well-balanced revenue stream of grants, donations, investment revenue, if you have some kind of endowment or something that's earning some kind of return on your investment, then I think diversifying that and making sure that your branding and message is out there correctly, so people can find you, I think is a good and looking at alternative funding. If you have something that's mainly funded by donors, a project or a program, looking to, are there grant funds available for that could stem, the loss of donations, I think is something to look at. So, and that's something they don't mention in the article, but I think it's vital for especially somebody in a finance and accounting position in a nonprofit to look at and to work with development on. You can't always rely on your big whales and small donations to carry an organization. You're at the whim of the public. So I think, looking at that, and then also looking to trim expenses, which we talk about so much money coming in, but are there, frills that you put into the nonprofit that are, not necessary, I guess, during an economic downturn? Do you have like subscription-based stuff that can kind of go away? Things like that. And I'm not necessarily thinking about losing employees, but tightening the expense belt and having like a look at what you're planning on spending. And we've talked many times about budgets here, and we've talked about kind of diverse funding streams, but also looking at what your expenditure load is going to be over the next year or so, and reassessing that maybe during an economic downturn, I think, are all stuff that probably should go with, something like this in an economic downturn. But, I understand they're focusing just on the giving portion, but yeah. So,
yeah. And of course, there's also a much larger conversation to be had about endowment funds, right? If your endowment funds are socked away in some investments that are losing value, how do you assess that and how do you look at that? So a larger conversation, which I'm sure we'll get into in weeks to come. So with that, AJ, why don't you give us our next article for the week?
Sure. So this comes our way of Philanthropy Daily, and it's Show Your True Self, Why Branding is Essential for Nonprofits. So this is a short, sweet kind of article about branding, and it's kind of a word that you hear a lot of, like represent your brand or do it for the brand or whatever these days with social media and everything. But so I think kind of understanding what that means for a nonprofit, or if you've had a bad experience with branding in the past, is kind of where this article comes from. So they talk about kind of what branding is, and I think everybody probably hopefully knows what branding is. It's essentially how you market your organization through social media, your website, donor relations, how you're presenting it, what's important to it, the mission, vision, all that good stuff. But they think, I think what they don't think about, or what often when crafting branding or how you're going to represent your nonprofit, they think about branding, but they don't think necessarily about how ethical it is. And so branding's necessary, but how is it ethical is the question that the article first poses. And they say, the short answer is that the ethics of branding lie within using truth and transparency to present your organization honestly. So they're talking about, going through this endeavor, and it forces an organization to know itself and to really uncover and define its purpose, its history, pin down the qualities that make it unique, and frame it in an overarching kind of story that everybody from a volunteer to the development department to the executive director can understand and deliver to somebody that asks. So they talk about, really diving in and understanding what that is. And if you don't take the time to do this, you're going to come up with a marketing strategy or a way to present the nonprofit that's not going to be coming from a place of fairness, or being transparent about it, or being like self-reflective on what they're doing. So they're talking about how you start the journey, and really regardless of your mission, really reflect and understand how your nonprofit impacts the community and the community at large, and the people that your nonprofit serves, and to make that into a really robust kind of marketing strategy or branding strategy behind that, and really bring in the human touch and the reach that you have and the underlying values that you have in your nonprofit. So I thought it's a short, sweet article. We'll link it below. I thought it was good, but I guess my take is I wish they would have gone a little bit further into how to craft it or what you need to be looking at. It's kind of a very punch list sort of, or bullet pointed kind of article. So Mark, I know you've had some experience internally in a nonprofit working with branding and marketing and such, so maybe you could give your slant on this.
Yeah, branding is such an interesting conversation because really, we come from a world 20, 30 years ago where branding was, advertising in a newspaper or putting your face on a bus stop, and some of these, there wasn't a lot of marketing and advertising that there is today, where every platform, every social media platform, getting out there with things such as, say, a podcast, that's a form of branding. So everything you kind of do as an individual representing a company becomes branding. So I think it's important to find what your mission is and what modes of branding can tie with that, right? Part of this article, one of the things they talk about is you want to be clear so that you don't have cringy forms of branding. And, if someone of my caliber got onto TikTok and started doing funny videos and pointing to certain things about nonprofits, I'm sorry, I would cringe. So, you got to kind of determine who you are, what your what you're trying to convey and have it be meaningful to your mission and purpose. I mean, truth and disclosure, part of the reason AJ and I do this podcast is to brand ourselves and to brand the company TCA that we work for. We don't talk about it a lot, but the work after 50 plus podcast episodes speaks for itself. We have branded ourselves as people who are very interested in nonprofits, are very interested in this space, and want to continue the conversation and want to keep up to date and abreast of the latest information. That's a form of branding for not only us, but for the company we work for. So this was a well thought out, crafted idea because it's something that we both have an interest in and something we want to contribute to not only society, but contribute to our careers. So we're not a nonprofit by any means, but we're here to support nonprofits. And I think using that as an example, AJ mentioned the place I used to work, they would figure out, it was a museum, and they would figure out specific exhibits or specific articles they could put out and position themselves well to get into the hands of people. On their website, on their Instagram, they would often post historical pictures that would garner lots of views, and they would try to kind of do that, I guess, shock and awe strategy of getting a lot of hits on something. But once you get people in the front door, keep them interested and keep them engaged regarding the history and the museum that existed there. So, all of this is a thought out marketing strategy. And, that phrase that, if you don't know if you're being marketed to, then the product is you. So just be aware that every company that's presenting themselves, if they're being unconscious about their marketing strategy, it comes across. And if you don't know what their marketing strategy is, then it's possible that you're being manipulated. So just have awareness. You want to have this trust that, especially as a nonprofit, in the sphere, you want to have trust in the community. You want to make your mission known, but you want to do it in a way that really isn't cringy.
Yeah, so true. I think, and that's a good point, Mark, kind of looking at the historical way. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, well, probably more like 30 years ago now, if you wanted to market, you went to a big, or rebrand yourself, that was like quite the endeavor. You would hire a marketing firm to do that and have a graphic design artist. And, there was a lot of steps, and it could be very, you didn't see people change logos or branding very often, because I think it was more of a, it was almost like you needed a group or a team behind it that knew what they were doing, or try to shoestring it together with volunteers through a nonprofit or something like that. But realistically, you were hiring firms in that now, being able to put your message out. I mean, 20 years ago, we couldn't do a podcast like this because you would need, a TV camera or a $2,000, $5,000 camera and sets and microphones. And now you're talking about, we can do this over Zoom or in person very inexpensively. And I think the same thing's true for branding and how you look at it. And spending your money wisely, I think, is another thing. If you're going through this process, do you hire somebody? Do you try to go it alone? Of course, professionals that work in this space are going to have a lot of insight, and especially somebody that would focus on nonprofits, I think, would have good insight for you. But weighing the cost and benefit of that, doing it yourself versus having a professional come in. And that's not to disparage anybody that is a professional marketing person in this space or in any space. I think that the work that they do is vital, and their insight can be really insightful. But let's be honest, there are a lot of how do we say it, fake marketing gurus out there, just as there's like, the fake Tony Robbins of the world or anything like that, or the Gary Vee knockoffs or anything like that you think about in sales or in marketing or in, marketing content that goes out. So I'd say be wary of who you're hiring, make sure they have a track record if you're going that route. And I think the article serves well as kind of like a baseline on how to look at this and how to make a change like that. So I think that's all that needs to be said about marketing. Although if you're a marketing professional and would like to come on the podcast, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Just make sure we'll do our due diligence to make sure you're not one of the shills out there. But no, I'm only kidding. But Mark, you have our next article, which is actually a continuation, part 2 from last week.
Yeah, this if you haven't listened to last week's article, I'll put a little context here, and Ethan, our great producer, will link that podcast in the notes as well. And this comes from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. It's from an article called 10 Nonprofit Funding Models. We went over 4 of them last time. And the basic gist of this is that you as a nonprofit cannot go after every form of funding out there that exists. So as a result, this article does a breakdown of 10 different kinds of models for funding your nonprofit. And the premise here is ask yourself some of these questions that we're going to pose here and see, does this make sense for my nonprofit? If it doesn't make sense at all, it's probably not worth going after those kinds of funds. But if it does ring true, or there's things you could do to kind of tweak this, then certainly these might be valuable revenue streams for you. So I'm going to just jump right into number 4. You can certainly, we did heartfelt connector, beneficiary builder, member motivator, and big better last time. So if those sound like a good tease, listen to that podcast. The next one in line is called the public provider. And so the public provider is going to work with government agencies to provide essential social services to the community. And some of the questions you might want to ask yourself if you want public provider funding is our organization a natural match with one or more large pre-existing government programs? Can we demonstrate that our organizations will do a better job than our competitors? And are we willing to take the time to secure contracts on a recurring basis? Because these contract renewals, they're going to take some time and they're going to take some energy. There's numerous examples of this in every state where you have these large, they talk about one in Texas called the Texas Migrant Council, where effectively they're doing the job that a government agency doesn't necessarily want to do. And so they get a lot of government support. The next one is called a policy innovator, also government related. You can tell just by the name. And they help to create novel methods to address social issues that are not clearly compatible with existing government funding programs. So this is going to be somebody who's advocating for specific policies. Of course, you need to figure out what that advocacy means, because if you get too political, you could be in jeopardy of losing your nonprofit status. But do we provide an innovative approach that surpasses the status quo? And can we provide government funders with evidence of how our program works? And then are we willing to cultivate strong relationships with government decision makers who will advocate for change? So this is working closely with the government to kind of help to create a movement of policy change. Next one is the beneficiary broker. And this allows you to compete with one another to provide government funded or backed services to beneficiaries. So you see these beneficiary brokers sometimes in housing, in employment services, in healthcare, and in student loans. So, so if you're trying to become one of these, it's hard to get in the ground if you're a beneficiary broker, but I'm thinking of companies that service student loans for the federal government. This is a type of beneficiary broker. They might act as a nonprofit, even though they're overseeing large amounts of money, or healthcare providers that are nonprofits that are getting government funding, et cetera. So can we demonstrate to the government our superior ability to benefit voucher holders with these kinds of benefits? Can we develop supplemental services that maximize the value of the benefits? So like something adjacent to the VA is what I'm thinking of here, right? Can we master government regulations and requirements needed? So that's our third government one of the day. And then, so now we're going to move away from government a little bit. Another funding source is called the resource recycler, and they collect in-kind donations from corporations and individuals and then distribute them, the donated goods, to needy recipients. So, food bank, Goodwill, et cetera. You're actually recycling goods for the benefit of a society. These again are kind of hard to get into from the ground up, but are there products that we distribute that are likely to be needed and donated on an ongoing basis? And can we develop the expertise to kind of be the linchpin to help do that? And then do we have a strategy? Very important here. Do we have a strategy for attracting the cash we'll need to fund the operations? Because you're not going to pay the rent just with in-kind donations if you don't have some other strategy where you're helping to bolster, and get your admin paid for, et cetera. All right. Number 9 out of 10 is the market maker. And they straddle the difference between an altruistic donor and a pay or motivated for market force. So this is a little bit of an odd one. It's a little bit specialized. But in this case, it's something like organ donation, right? It would be really distasteful to have an organ donation system where the person who can pay the most gets the organs first. So these kinds of nonprofits can step in and act as the altruistic entity, the nonprofit entity that can help kind of oversee these things while still bringing in fee revenue for something like an organ donation transplant. So, are there legal or ethical reasons in your organization why it would be more appropriate for a nonprofit to deliver the services? I think that's the crux question of this one. You also will need a trusted name and a trusted brand, because no Joe Schmo off the street can go in and say, I'm in organ donation now. It's a little bit odd. So, and then finally, we got the local nationalizer. So this is getting funding for organizations that are nonprofits on a local level, but also have a larger national presence. They mentioned the big brothers and big sisters in here. There are other organizations that do similar work. So do we have an organization that addresses local issues that are considered a priority, but yet do we want to expand that mission across the country and have lots of little organizations all over the place? Can our model of nonprofit be replicated all over the place? So this is a lot of, these are the sort of the 10 ways they break down that funding can come in the door. It's really important for each nonprofit leader to emphasize and investigate their funding strategy closely, and then be disciplined about the way they collect money. So just kind of poking around and figuring out what you're going to do. It might bring in some money for the short term, but a long-term strategy, you can help line up some of your goals. So I was impressed with this article. I think it really helps kind of give you a 30,000-foot level of what's different strategies you should go for. And I've talked plenty, so I'm going to let AJ take over.
Sure. No, I'm really impressed with how this, we've talked on this program quite a bit about, kind of like funding models for nonprofits and how they kind of fall in 3 groups, where it's like donations, government grants, private grants, and then kind of an investment or resale type of model of like a Goodwill, right? I think, or like a thrift store or something like that. So it was really nice to see those categories kind of defined further and kind of like broken apart. And I would suggest our listeners listen to the first part that we put up from our last episode, because I think then you really get an idea, because the first episode was really about the donation kind of bulk of a nonprofit. And this really gets into those other 2 categories that we always talk about, grant funding, government or private grant funding would be those first 3 that we talked about: the public provider, the policy innovator, and the beneficiary broker. I think those are really centered around private and especially governmental grants. And then you get into the others, you know what I mean? Like the recycler and the market maker. And I've worked with every single one type of these types of organizations when I was in public accounting as an auditor. And it's really unique to see how they define themselves and how they strategize around what type of organization without even knowing that they were, kind of defining themselves like that. So when I think about like those first 3, those public providers, the policy innovators, and the beneficiary brokers, there might be some crossover between like a policy innovator and like a market maker, like a land trust or whatever that they talk about. That could also include some kind of policy innovator where you're striving for like public wetlands, but you're also a land trust that holds those in perpetuity from private donations that at some point owned a wetland and was, determined that way. So there can be some crossover there, and I think your organization's funding sources can fall into a couple of these, like, kind of, but really defining what your organization at the top level, how they want to operate, and using the other ones as supplemental to that, I think is really, a good thought exercise for a nonprofit when they're thinking about funding or how they're going to do it, and about what they're doing and how they fit into these kind of definitions that we're given. But the one that I really thought was interesting was that resource recycler. It doesn't need to be like a Goodwill or a food bank. We have a local organization called like Free Geek, which deals with e-waste recycling. So you go and donate your old computer to them. They have a resale site. They have they make the majority of their money outside of grants by reselling used computer parts, and they're reducing e-waste. And they have this really good public-facing kind of mission that I think is good for donations to come in, but also they're kind of self-sustaining in the fact that they get free stuff and they resell it, much like a Goodwill, but you don't need to have that kind of Goodwill or thrift store kind of thing. They're very focused and singular on this e-waste thing. So I think it's interesting to think about that, and then to come up with a budgeting or a funding kind of game plan around what type of organization you are. And in fact, I'm going to use this article when I'm thinking about or get asked questions about funding sources, because I think taking a look at this article and really defining where your organization fits within this kind of metrics of these 10 types of funders, I think gives more clarity to the development department, the budgeting process of how you're going to obtain funds, and which categories your organization, either, the top level one and then kind of the supplementary ones that go along there, and I think of like, all those different nonprofits that have a small thrift store as an addition to what they normally do. There could be like the resource recycler, but also has like the essentially the thrift store along with it for excess donations that are too nice to give away, or they think they can make money off of by selling through this thrift store, and then other things get given away to underserved communities. I think knowing that and understanding that is like a really good step in, really well defining how your organization is funded.
Yeah, and I just want to add, AJ, I think those are great points. I think this is a great exercise to bring forth to a board, especially if you're a new nonprofit and you're trying to figure out which lanes you're going to operate in. Some of these questions within this article are super tangible, where you can read these questions and go, yeah, our nonprofit doesn't do that at all. And then you can just sort of go, let's not even focus on that income stream, because I know sometimes when you're starting a nonprofit, it's just like, okay, there's all these different directions we can go, and it's like drinking from a fire hose. And this can actually help narrow down and focus, where you can focus on getting your money and where you can, actually be effective in your space. Because if you answer these questions, yeah, we do that, then we should definitely be going for these kinds of funds.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the type of governmental grants that you get and corporate grants are going to be much different than the type of funding that's received from like, the resource recycler or like those land trusts. Yeah, you might be able to get some government grants for that, but your funding strategy needs to be vastly different than like a public health delivery service, or like those, like what Mark talked about, like a VA adjacent type of helping organization. The funding is going to be different for those, usually those ones that we just talked about, like the mental health delivery or public health service. There's lots of grants for that. There's lots of government assistance for that can come your way, even governmental and state and local. We've seen an influx, at least I have, in the funding around healthcare and mental health over the last 3 years because of the pandemic. And then, so lots of money is coming in through grant wise that way. Whereas if you're a different type of organization, like we talked about, like a hybrid, like public goods or, help, and then a thrift store, there may not be as many governmental grants available. So that maybe need to be a secondary kind of thought in your organization. And then the fact that like, maybe a lot of people don't give donations out, cash donations to those types of places, kind of leads you in a way that you might make that your third priority in donation wise. Of course, you're always going to want, a diversified stream, but really realizing where your time and effort needs to be spent, I think, is vital in this. And so I think, again, I think it's a great article. And I think it's a different way to think about classifying what type of organization or what your major funding sources are.
Yeah, another great article from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. If you couldn't tell, AJ and I are fanboys over here. So.
Yeah, fanboy out every time a new article comes. Oh my God.
All right, so we got our question of the day, AJ. Why don't you take it away?
Sure. So this came in, and this actually, it's not a specific question. They got sent it to me, but it was, I was talking with an organization, and they were really wondering. The situation was they had two employees that were up for a similar position, and the one employee was chosen because of their work merit, and the one kind of, I guess now that would be, they were kind of an equal footing, and the one that was made given the promotion felt bad, as somebody might do when you're working closely with somebody. And so they brought the other person up with them, essentially gave them some more responsibilities, gave them a little fancier title with their new position, and wanted to kind of bring them along. But the other person that was left behind, for lack of a better word, was kind of vindictive, and they were kind of, a poison in the well, so to say. So they were kind of being mean-spirited about the person that got the promotion, was causing problems within the organization. And so the decision was made to let them go. And the conversation was centered around, how do they let them go without, making them look like a bad person or leaving a bad taste in their mouth? And so, there's a couple ways to do it, putting them onto like what's known, if you've ever been in the public accounting realm, it's called a PIP, but what is it? A personal improvement plan is what it's called. So making them aware that they're falling short, and then, giving them goals on how they can right the ship, and giving them the opportunity to change it around, and, recognizing that they may not be happy and doing that. And then the other one is, you just let them fail and let them leave. But I think, that suggestion sometimes can seem mean-spirited. It can kind of damage your organization if you allow that, that internal strife to remain. It can cause division within the nonprofit. And then really, like making sure that you remember how this person can affect your organization. So those were my suggestions, I guess, was kind of putting them on a PIP or a personal improvement plan on how they can turn it around, or just allowing them to fail and letting them go. But in thinking about that, I think there's probably some better ways to go about this. But Mark, I'll let you chime in and kind of give your 2 cents on what you think on this.
Yeah, I mean, these employment questions are tricky, right? Because you want to do everything by the book. You want to be legal. You want to make sure all your legal ducks and your HR ducks are in a row. But the primary problem here, right, is that when you create a situation where you've empowered somebody who then becomes toxic for the organization, it's like, how do you get rid of that cancer to the organization? And what I have seen happen in a number of organizations, and has personally affected me, is that when you have somebody who's so toxic at an organization, they can force good people to leave. And those good people, you can lose them left and right, especially if you have a manager who's a toxic manager and a terrible person, right? Who's really affecting the organization negatively. It's going to end up costing the organization more in the long run than it is if you just manage the problem at the outset. And because, in nonprofit, it takes a certain kind of person to work in a nonprofit, and often to be in leadership at a nonprofit, one who's service-oriented, one who tends to be friendly and not just concerned about the bottom line and is concerned about people. And it becomes hard, right? If you're one of those people who avoids conflicts, or you're a people pleaser, you don't want to fire people. You want to just kind of coast along and this will work itself out. But the problem is that then you start having this self-selecting situation where good employees are quitting because you're not dealing with the toxic personality. So I think AJ's suggestions of concrete performance plans, or even getting going so far as if you're at the head of this situation, creating a plan where you kind of look at what success looks like for 30 days, for 90 days, and just kind of look at those metrics for yourself. Like, is this person bringing value to the position? Even if they're doing all the X, Y, and Z items that they're tasked to do in their job description, are they toxic to the environment, right? Because you can have a great accountant who's doing all the, ticking all the numbers and creating beautiful financials, but if everyone hates them and hates coming to work, it's a problem of a whole different color. So, I would say get other people involved, right? Make sure you're documenting, get other people involved. And, sometimes you have to really just pony up and take your lumps, right? Sometimes you just have to go down the road of firing somebody. And then, it's not going to be pleasant. You're not going to be the most well-liked person by that person. But honestly, a lot of people behind the scenes will probably be cheering you on.
Well, and I think you make good points, Mark. And I think when it comes time to let that person go, I think the traditional way of doing it, telling them on a Friday and, having them leave in front of everybody with a box full of stuff and then make an announcement afterwards, I think that's kind of antiquated, to be honest. I think developing a strategy where the person can leave, where they're not going to essentially badmouth the organization for leaving, just let that person know this isn't working, and it's apparently not working for us, and it's apparently not working for you, but let's make this split as amicable as possible, and we'll give you a time frame to, let's develop a narrative of why you left. You're pursuing new opportunities, whatever that may be, and allow them a graceful exit.
You want to spend more time with your family? That's a good one.
Right. But allowing them a graceful exit, you know what I mean? And understanding that this isn't working out. Obviously, you're not happy here because of X, Y, Z, and we're not happy here because of X, Y, Z. Let's make a mutual split and let's make it as amicable as possible and save face all the way around by developing a plan with that person that, now, granted, if somebody's super toxic or is committing, unspeakable things that can't be excused away, you have to let them go immediately. But allowing you, the organization and the employee, to be able to craft something on why they left and how they left and pursuing new opportunities, and we wish them the best, all of that good stuff can make a big difference. And I think make people feel like, because I think what happens when a round of firing happens, or somebody in a position that maybe you liked, you didn't know what was going on, and they get fired, like, the conversation then turns to, oh my gosh, am I next? People get anxious around the office. What's going on? Why did this happen? If you're not on the inside and knowing all the ins and outs, it can be a real head scratcher for some people around the office. So crafting this plan on how both of you are going to move forward with them not being there, and allowing them, and wishing them the best, and all that kind of thing, I think can go a long way in quelling anybody's, uncertainty about their job positions or about the direction that the nonprofit or business is going, and allow that person to save face, professionally and personally.
Right. And then it also is better for them when they're looking for their new position, that they can use you as a reference and not have to explain that they were fired because they're an asshole. On that note, sorry.
Exactly. Hey, we don't pull any punches here. Yeah. You're a jerk.
Well, we certainly appreciate you joining us here today. And, of course, AJ and I are really thankful for the audience that we have, and to be able to bring you this information and to brand ourselves as those who love to bring you the latest nonprofit accounting news. So on behalf of AJ and myself, please join us again next time. Join us on Twitter @ProfitlessPod, and please send us your questions. We love to engage with you. Thanks very much. See ya.
Thanks, everybody.